In the sweltering summer of 1828, in a small Georgian town where the moss hung heavy from the oaks like the shadows of forgotten souls, a single scream cut through the humid night. The air was thick with the scent of river mud and candle smoke, and yet it was a sound so sharp, so unnatural, that every dog, every child shivered in their sleep. They said it came from the white-clapboard house at the edge of town, a home that should have been ordinary, a home that should have held life, laughter, and family. But that night, the house whispered secrets that would haunt the county for decades. They say the walls themselves seemed to breathe with a rhythm of fear, a heartbeat that wasn't human. And inside, behind closed doors, shadows moved with intent, deliberate, almost predatory. People spoke in hushed tones at the market the next morning, their voices trembling as they recounted what they had or hadn't seen. "It's just a woman," one mother said, gripping her children tightly, "a wife tending to her husband." But the eyes of those who had dared glance through the windows told a different story. Curtains fluttering though no breeze entered, lamps extinguished one by one, and the faint smell of iron, of blood, lingering in corners where dust should have settled. And yet, it wasn't the scream alone that made the townspeople uneasy. It was the promise that had preceded it, a vow spoken on the porch under the gold haze of evening sun, a vow that she would love, cherish, and remain forever faithful, forever devoted. "Forever," she had said, and everyone believed her, because who would suspect death could wear the gentle face of a wife, singing lullabies and preparing supper, and yet hiding shadows deep within her home? I want you to imagine it now. The cicadas droning in the trees, the flicker of candlelight on a polished table, and a single figure standing in the hallway, silhouetted, watching, waiting. That figure held a secret the town could not yet comprehend. That figure held the power to twist love into horror, devotion into murder. The quiet of the house that night was not peace. It was the calm before a storm that would tear the town's illusions apart, brick by brick, heart by heart. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The morning sun rose over the town, turning the humidity into a heavy golden haze, and life appeared to return to normal. Children ran barefoot through the dusty streets, women hung laundry from the lines, and men went about their trades, hammering wood and shaping iron, as if nothing had happened the night before. But the house at the edge of town stood silent, untouched by the routine that enveloped the rest of the town. Its white paint had begun to flake in the summer heat, and the windows reflected sunlight like empty eyes, staring back at any who dared look too closely. Inside, the house told a different story. Shadows clung to the corners, whispering secrets that no one outside could hear. The floorboards creaked with weightless footsteps, the kind that didn't belong to a living body. And in the kitchen, where the scent of baking bread should have welcomed visitors, there lingered the faint coppery smell of something far more sinister. Her hands moved with precision, chopping and stirring, but there was an unnatural rhythm to her movements, as though she was conducting an invisible orchestra of terror. The neighbors began to notice small oddities. Windows left open would be found closed. Lights that had burned out were replaced with ones that no one remembered lighting. Meals left on tables would disappear without explanation. The town dismissed it at first as simple forgetfulness or the tricks of the summer heat. But the unease grew, gnawing at their subconscious like a persistent itch they couldn't scratch. The mother at the market, who had dismissed the scream, now watched her children more closely, counting them, recounting them, as if just verifying their existence could protect them from the house that seemed to inhale and exhale with dark intent. At the heart of this quiet terror was her face, smiling, warm, attentive, a wife who promised forever, a wife who kept secrets deeper than the roots of the oaks surrounding her home. Those who met her eyes felt both comforted and unsettled, as if she carried within her a knowledge that could unravel the very nature of trust and love. And yet, she remained a fixture of the community, a figure untouchable, above suspicion, because who could imagine such darkness lurking beneath embroidered aprons and gentle words? And so the town continued. Each day, a careful balancing act between normalcy and dread, unaware that their collective denial was the fuel that would allow horror to grow. Every smile she gave, every handshake, was a thread tightening the noose of inevitability. And when the time came, the full scope of her intentions would leave no mind unshaken. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Her name was Margaret Whitfield, though few in the town remembered who she had been before marriage. Born in the late winter of 1805, she arrived with eyes too sharp for a child, observing, calculating, absorbing every whisper and glance, as if storing secrets in some hidden ledger of the mind. Her father, a man of stern habits and a reputation for harsh discipline, had raised her in a home where obedience was currency and fear a lesson. Margaret had learned early that power often wore the face of gentleness, that a soft word could conceal a blade sharper than any weapon in the barn. As she grew, Margaret exhibited a strange charm, an uncanny ability to draw trust, even from strangers. Visitors would leave her home prizing her warmth, never realizing that the very same warmth could become an instrument of control. In the small candlelit corners of the Whitfield house, she spent hours alone, reading obscure texts, scribbling notes, and practicing subtle manipulations with her younger siblings. By the age of 20, she had mastered the art of influence. She could bend a stubborn child to her will, coax secrets from the most reticent servant, and sway the opinions of her elders without ever raising her voice. It was no coincidence then that when she married Jonathan Whitman, a local farmer with ambitions bigger than his means, the match seemed perfect to outsiders. He was strong, trusted, and deeply in love, or so he believed. What he could not perceive was the slow, methodical way Margaret began to weave herself into the very foundations of his life, his home, and eventually, his psyche. Every compliment, every act of care, every night spent at his side was carefully calibrated. Margaret's love was a weapon, honed over decades, aimed at securing control that few could even comprehend. Even among her closest neighbors, whispers began to circulate, little anomalies, dismissed as imagination or coincidence. The way she lingered at windows at dusk, watching, noting. The sudden illnesses that struck animals and children in the vicinity. Odd arrangements in her garden, geometric and precise, that no gardener would naturally design. And yet, her smile never wavered. Her voice remained soothing, her hands immaculate. It was in this paradox, perfect civility concealing meticulous darkness, that Margaret's true nature lived, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. To truly understand what would happen in the Whitman household, you must remember this. History does not reveal itself to the unobservant. It waits for those willing to peer into shadows to question love, loyalty, and the very nature of trust. Margaret's story was not just a tale of marital horror, it was a lesson in the seductive power of hidden intent and the terrifying cost of underestimating subtlety. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as most horrors do. At first, a missing chicken, a misplaced tool, the faintest odor of iron in the kitchen air. Neighbors would shrug, dismissing the occurrences as forgetfulness or the quirks of rural life. But then, Margaret's actions grew stranger, almost imperceptibly orchestrated to unsettle those around her. Servants whispered of objects moved in impossible ways, cupboards left ajar, and windows shut tight even when open minutes before. Dogs barked at empty corners, refusing to enter rooms where she lingered, and children awoke screaming in the dead of night, unable to recall what had terrified them. Jonathan Whitman noticed it too, though he could not put a name to the unease that clawed at his mind. A lamp would be found extinguished when he swore he had left it burning. Food prepared with care would suddenly spoil, turning sweet milk sour in hours, or a roast left to cool would bear strange punctures, as though some invisible hand had tested it. When he asked Margaret, she would smile, sweet and innocent, and speak of accidents, of summer's heat, of a world misaligned by chance. And yet, the sensation of being watched never left him. Each glance toward her seemed to carry a weight, a silent judgment he could not escape. The town too began to murmur. People who had once admired Margaret's composure now felt a creeping suspicion that she was more than she appeared. A child had disappeared for a night and returned without explanation, muttering nonsense about the lady in the hall who wanted me to stay. Livestock fell ill under mysterious circumstances, neighbors reported shadows moving against the light, and Jonathan himself began to question reality. Were the noises at night simply the wind, or something far more deliberate? Margaret's calm, attentive presence only deepened the dread. She never scolded, never raised her voice, never let a hint of malice escape her perfectly formed lips. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part. Evil hidden behind grace, cruelty wrapped in devotion, death lurking beneath the soft glow of domesticity. The town was on the edge of recognition, sensing that something unspeakable had taken root, yet powerless to name it or stop it, without condemning themselves to ridicule, or worse. And so the stage was set. A house that breathed with menace, a wife whose love was a weapon, and a husband slowly unraveling in the presence of calculated, invisible horror. The first threads of fear had been woven into the town's collective consciousness, and what came next would leave no corner untouched. At first, the disappearances were small, almost negligible. A chicken, a piglet, a neighbor's tool left behind a strange smear of mud and blood. People whispered and laughed nervously, telling themselves that rural life was simply unpredictable. But then, children began to vanish. Little feet that had run barefoot through the streets no longer padded on the dusty roads. Mothers would call from porches, their voices cracking with anxiety, only to find empty yards and doors locked tight from the inside. And Margaret, ever composed, offered comfort in her soft voice, lulling suspicion with kindness, even as her eyes betrayed the faintest glint of knowing satisfaction. Jonathan began to notice patterns he could not understand. The disappearances always seemed to coincide with her errands into the woods at twilight. He once followed silently, hiding behind trees, watching as Margaret knelt by a shallow depression in the soil. She murmured words he could not decipher, and when he stepped closer, she turned with a serene smile, her hands clean, her dress untouched. Yet the air smelled faintly metallic, like copper and rust, and the earth beneath her hands was darker than the surrounding soil. Fear began to take root in Jonathan's mind, fear he could neither confess nor fully comprehend. Neighbors whispered rumors, their voices low and urgent. Some swore they saw shadows moving within the house that did not belong to any human. Others claimed that Margaret's garden, so meticulously arranged, was a map of deaths, each flower and shrub marking an unspoken incident. Even the clergy, who had once praised her devotion and piety, began to avert their gaze when passing her doorstep. Something unnatural lingered in the air, a quiet authority that demanded silence and compliance from anyone who dared question it. Yet the true horror remained hidden. Margaret's household functioned with eerie perfection. Meals were prepared on time, rooms were spotless, and the children who remained were attentive, obedient, and strangely subdued, as if some invisible hand guided their every action. And the town, unaware of the depth of her manipulation, began to normalize the abnormal. People avoided her gaze, dismissed their instincts, and whispered only in secret. Jonathan knew, deep in his gut, that a point of no return was approaching. Something inside that pristine house waited, patient and inevitable, and when it revealed itself, it would consume more than innocence. It would consume the very perception of safety, love, and trust that the town had held dear. And no one would emerge unchanged. The day of discovery arrived with the suddenness of a storm. A neighbor, uneasy and sleepless after nights of hearing faint cries echoing from the Whitman house, finally gathered the courage to investigate. She approached the white clapboard home at dusk, lantern in hand, heart hammering against her ribs, every instinct screaming retreat, But the lure of truth, irresistible and dangerous, pulled her closer. The front door, ever so slightly ajar, creaked as she pushed it, revealing the still, almost reverent silence of a home perfectly maintained. It was in the hallway that she first saw it. The faint stains, so subtle they might have been overlooked, tracing a path toward the cellar door. Margaret's laughter floated down from above, soft, melodic, impossibly calm. The neighbor froze. Each step toward the cellar was a descent into the unknown. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of decay and iron. Then she saw it. The handle, streaked, sticky, and glinting faintly in the lantern light. Something, terrible and deliberate, awaited below. Jonathan arrived moments later, summoned by instinct and dread, though by then it was too late. Together they descended, lanterns shaking in their hands. And there, in the dim glow, the truth revealed itself. Chains lined the stone walls, crude but strong. Wooden beams bore fresh scratches, deep as if resisting a struggle. And in the center, the floor bore depressions, small, precise, carved with an almost ritualistic attention. Margaret herself emerged from the shadows, serene, smiling, as if nothing unnatural had occurred, as if she were merely welcoming them home. Bodies, or parts of them, hidden behind panels and beneath the cellar floor, told a story of meticulous horror. Children, animals, servants who had disappeared, all accounted for in the quiet calculus of her design. Jonathan's stomach turned. The neighbor cried out, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive weight of the house itself. Margaret's eyes met his, calm, controlling, almost triumphantly detached. In that gaze lay the full understanding. She had orchestrated every disappearance, every whisper of fear, every subtle manipulation, and yet she remained untouchable because love and trust had been the masks she wore flawlessly. Authorities arrived, drawn by panic and rumor, but the scene defied reason. The town gasped in disbelief as they tried to catalogue horrors their minds could not fully process. Yet even as arrests were made, Margaret's composure never faltered. She understood power beyond the law, beyond morality. What she had created was a system of obedience and terror, invisible until it could no longer be ignored, and by then, the damage was irreparable. The house remained, a monument to her methodical cruelty, and those who glimpsed the truth, once, could never unsee it. The town erupted in chaos the moment the truth escaped the Whitman house. Mothers wept openly, clutching children who had narrowly escaped, while fathers stood frozen, rage and disbelief warring in their eyes. Newspapers arrived from neighboring counties, eager to capture the story, yet each article faltered under the weight of disbelief. How could a wife, so adored, so seemingly pure, orchestrate horrors of such calculated precision? The community struggled to reconcile the Margaret they knew, the smiling, attentive wife, with the architect of terror that now confronted them. Yet the chaos revealed another layer of darkness. As authorities probed deeper, questions arose that no one dared ask aloud. Why had so many disappearances gone unnoticed for years? Why had certain officials turned blind eyes, claiming bureaucratic oversight or miscommunication? Rumors spread that Margaret had connections beyond the town, allies who quietly ensured her actions would remain unchecked until discovery became unavoidable. Papers went missing, witnesses intimidated, and the courthouse itself seemed to falter under pressure from invisible hands. The horror was no longer confined to a single house. It had woven itself into the very fabric of the county's institutions. Jonathan, still reeling from the betrayal of trust, found himself isolated. Those who once respected him now whispered that he had been complicit by inaction. Neighbors who had admired his household prowess recoiled, unable to reconcile the presence of evil in such close proximity. Margaret, meanwhile, was moved through the legal system with an eerie calmness, her composure so complete it unsettled even seasoned officers. In court, she spoke softly, weaving charm and logic into her testimony, dismantling accusations with a meticulous precision that left jurors uncertain of reality itself. Some historians, years later, would note the inconsistencies. Evidence destroyed, records lost, testimonies altered. They called it anomalous oversight, a curious footnote in the town's chronicles. But those who had been present remembered differently. They remembered fear that had not been born of rumor alone, but of knowing too intimately the subtle power of a mind capable of turning devotion into death. They remembered the way Margaret's calm gaze silenced not just voices, but instincts. And they understood, perhaps too late, that evil is often less about violence and more about control. The Whitman household, once the epicenter of ordinary life, became a cautionary shadow. Its doors remained closed, but whispers persisted, floating on summer nights when the cicadas droned and the oaks swayed, as if the trees themselves carried memory. The lesson was unavoidable. Horror does not always announce itself in chaos. Sometimes it waits, patient, calculating, wearing a face we choose to trust. Years passed, but the shadow of Margaret Whitman's deeds never left the town. Streets that once echoed with laughter now carried a cautious silence, a subtle tension in every footstep. Parents taught their children to obey, not out of love alone, but out of fear of what might lie hidden behind the masks of those closest to them. Even the adults who had survived the revelations were haunted. Dreams became restless, minds lingered on shadows, and no one could look at a familiar face without questioning the possibility of concealed intent. The lesson had been seared into the town's collective consciousness. Trust could be weaponized, love could conceal, death and ordinary life was never truly safe. Psychologists, if any had existed with them, proper vocabulary, would have described a community gripped by trauma, a web of fear and hypervigilance woven into the very culture of the place. But the explanations offered publicly were simpler. Tragic events, moral failings, unlucky circumstances. No one spoke of the elegance of manipulation, the precision of Margaret's methods, or the way she had orchestrated obedience like a silent symphony. Her influence lingered not just in memory, but in the psychological patterns she had embedded into the minds of everyone who encountered her. The children who survived whispered about doors that opened on their own, footsteps that belonged to no one, and eyes that seemed to watch from empty corners. The authorities had tried to write their reports, but even bureaucracies have blind spots. Some officials dismissed the events as aberrations, others quietly ensured that records remained vague, obscuring the systematic nature of the terror. And in doing so, they had replicated Margaret's most potent power, control from the shadows. The town learned, perhaps unconsciously, to normalize silence, to obey invisible rules, and to fear what could not be named. Even when newspapers published sensationalized accounts of the case, the deeper truth of calculated psychological mastery remained buried, known only to a select few. The house itself, long abandoned, became a symbol. Travelers passing by sensed an unnatural weight in the air, a quiet oppression that seemed almost alive, and those who stayed too long reported whispers of patterns, geometries, and hidden messages that were never there before. Margaret's legacy was not just death, it was a lesson in systems of control, in invisible chains that could govern thought, behavior, and emotion. Now consider this carefully. Every society, every community has its shadows. Some are obvious, some invisible. But those who understand the invisible chains, who recognize manipulation and deceit, are changed forever. And that is exactly what Margaret Whitman taught, whether the town knew it or not. The truth, as always, is rarely the version that history records. In the years following the Whitman case, investigators and journalists discovered hints of a pattern far beyond a single household. Reports from surrounding counties, long dismissed as coincidental tragedies, began to align in unsettling ways. Disappearances, inexplicable deaths, sudden illnesses and accidents, events that had once seemed isolated, revealed themselves as threads in a much larger tapestry of control and deception. What Margaret had embodied in a single house was, it seemed, a method practiced and perfected across generations, buried beneath the polite facades of families, institutions, and towns. Some scholars later suggested that powerful figures had long recognized the efficacy of influence, hidden beneath affection and obedience. Communities were conditioned to ignore warning signs, officials trained to accept partial truths, and laws designed to protect were often used to conceal. Margaret's case, while extreme, was not unique. It was a microcosm, a mirror reflecting systems of manipulation that functioned invisibly throughout society. Every smile, every act of generosity, every trust placed unquestioningly in human decency could be weaponized by those who understood human nature in its rawest, most malleable form. And yet, the public narrative remained simple. The tragedy of a deranged wife, a horrific but isolated tale, a cautionary story whispered in hushed tones. No one spoke openly of the techniques she had mastered, the psychological calibration, the orchestration of fear, the subtle orchestration of behavior until resistance became impossible. These were tools, knowledge, methods, dangerous knowledge, that if understood could alter the very balance of power in any home, any institution, any society. Margaret had wielded them perfectly, leaving only the faintest imprint of her method for the perceptive to decipher. The deeper horror lay not just in her actions, but in the systems that allowed her to operate undetected for so long. Patterns of denial, oversight, and complicit silence were not accidents. They were cultivated. Every official who missed a clue, every neighbor who dismissed unease, every family member who ignored instinct had participated in her silent triumph. And this is the lesson most fail to recognize. True control is not always enforced through fear or violence. It is enforced through invisibility, through the quiet conditioning of obedience and the normalization of denial. If you are following carefully, you begin to see the pattern, not just in Margaret Whitman, but in any structure of power that prefers secrecy to truth, order to justice, appearance to reality. And now, if you are willing to take this knowledge further, I want you to participate. In the comments below, write the phrase, "I see the shadow," twice. This will mark your understanding, your awareness, and engage you with the algorithm that amplifies hidden truths to those who seek them. Margaret's genius lay not in brute force, but in subtlety. She understood the mind, not just of her husband, but of the entire town. Each gesture, each word, each glance was carefully calibrated to elicit trust, obedience, and fear in precisely equal measure. She knew instinctively that control is most absolute when invisible, when the target believes themselves free, when terror is disguised as affection. Love, she realized, could be more lethal than any weapon. Devotion could be more binding than chains. She observed patterns of human behavior with a patience few could endure. A child afraid of the dark? She would place them alone at night, whispering promises of protection while planting a seed of doubt that grew unseen. A neighbor skeptical of her intentions? A perfectly timid compliment, a shared task, a smile, and suspicion would melt like ice under the sun. Even Jonathan, strong, rational, and well-respected, fell prey to her orchestration. He could not perceive her manipulations because she had conditioned him over months, then years, to trust, to defer, and ultimately to ignore his own intuition. Her psychological methods were frighteningly systematic. She studied reactions, tested boundaries, and exploited weaknesses in ways that seemed almost ceremonial. A misplaced object, a strange noise, a shadow cast by candlelight, all became instruments in her symphony of influence. The house itself became a tool, each room a stage where subtle terror and gentle reassurance danced in perfect balance. By the time suspicion arose, her control was already complete. She had rewritten the perception of reality for anyone within her sphere. And yet, this was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a demonstration of understanding human nature at its deepest level, a revelation of the mechanisms that govern obedience, fear, and loyalty. Margaret's actions exposed a universal truth, that the foundations of trust and love are fragile, and those who grasp the hidden levers of influence wield power that far exceeds the blunt application of violence. The true horror, then, is not the physical act of harm. It is the realization that the mind itself can be enslaved without chains, without weapons, without witnesses. Every step she took, every manipulation, was both deliberate and instructive. She left lessons embedded in the lives of those around her, lessons in obedience, vigilance, and fear. For those willing to see, her home became a mirror of society's hidden mechanisms, a blueprint of psychological domination that transcends time and place. Long after the initial discovery, a small bundle of papers was found hidden in the walls of the Whitman house. Years, loathed with age, brittle at the edges, they bore Margaret's precise handwriting, calculations, observations, and chillingly detailed accounts of her manipulations. Every disappearance, every illness, every subtle act of terror had been documented. She recorded reactions, measured responses, and annotated her findings with a clarity that suggested not madness, but method. It was as if she had created a manual for control, a guide to bending human behavior like clay. One journal entry described a night when she had orchestrated a neighborhood-wide panic with nothing more than the flicker of a lantern and a carefully timed scream. Another recounted the effect of a whispered rumor on a child's psyche, the way fear could metastasize through innocence. She marked her observations with meticulous symbols, as if encrypting her methods from anyone who might stumble upon them, yet leaving enough clues for the perceptive mind to unravel. The sophistication was staggering, almost surgical in precision. These documents revealed the scope of her vision. Margaret's cruelty was not random. It was deliberate, anticipatory, and profoundly strategic. She understood that true power is hidden, not flaunted. While townspeople noticed oddities, she had already accounted for them, embedding layers of misdirection and psychological traps that ensured no one could fully comprehend her design until it was too late. Her writings hinted at a philosophy that extended beyond her household, a belief in the subtle domination of human perception, a mastery over the systems that govern thought and obedience. Historians would later debate the implications, calling her a monster, a genius, or perhaps both. Yet those who studied the manuscripts in detail realized something more unsettling. Margaret's lessons were not limited to her era. They revealed timeless methods of manipulation, applicable anywhere trust could be weaponized, obedience demanded, or fear concealed behind affection. The line between love and control, between devotion and terror, had been blurred to a degree that challenged the very notions of morality. And now consider carefully what this means. These writings are not simply the musings of a deranged mind. They are a roadmap for understanding power, influence, and the hidden levers that shape human behavior. For those willing to confront it, this is dangerous knowledge, knowledge that changes perception permanently and perhaps irrevocably. Margaret's reach extended far beyond the walls of her home, though few realized it at the time. Authorities who were supposed to investigate, neighbors who witnessed oddities, even friends of the family. Each had been subtly guided by her hand, often without conscious awareness. Small favors, casual conversations, carefully placed observations. These were not acts of kindness, but tools of control. A whispered suggestion here, a seemingly innocent story there, and suddenly the town's perception bent to her will. Suspicion was diverted, doubts quietly quelled, and curiosity softened into compliance. Even the local magistrates, men proud of their judgment and authority, found themselves acting in ways they couldn't explain. They would dismiss reports of disappearances or strange happenings, attributing them to coincidence, misfortune, or the exaggerations of overworked townsfolk. Letters lost, testimonies ignored, and decisions made with subtle bias. All these small manipulations ensured that Margaret's system remained invisible, self-protecting, and most importantly, untouchable. What appeared to outsiders as incompetence or oversight was in truth a perfectly orchestrated extension of her power. Neighbors noticed only what she allowed them to notice. A child missing? Blame the heat. A strange sound in the night? The wind or the dog? No one questioned the pattern too closely because Margaret had conditioned them to assume normalcy, to trust appearances, and to fear the social consequences of probing too deeply. Her understanding of fear and trust was applied not just to individuals, but to the community itself, shaping behavior through anticipation and subtle suggestion. And while the Whitman household became the focal point of horror, the truth was far broader. Margaret's influence operated like a virus. Small, invisible, insidious. The more the town attempted to recover, to reclaim ordinary life, the more it was drawn into her quiet web. What they believed to be normal social interaction, neighborly oversight, or bureaucratic efficiency was, in many ways, an extension of her deliberate design. Even in her absence, the psychological patterns she instilled continued to dictate behavior, keeping suspicion dormant and obedience alive. By the time historians or investigators pieced together fragments of the events, the full measure of Margaret's manipulation remained obscured. And this is where the lesson becomes clear. True control is rarely wielded through force. It is wielded invisibly, systematically, and with patience. Those who understand it are changed forever. Those who ignore it remain captives of perception, blind to the mechanisms shaping their reality. Survivors of the Whitman household were forever changed, though few could articulate why. Even years later, the memory of Margaret's serene smile haunted them, a symbol of the invisible chains she had forged. Children who had escaped, or who had been spared, grew into adults hyper-aware of every gesture, every word, every glance, as if the world itself could be weaponized against them. They learned fear not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet, constant companion, threading its way into every decision, every thought, every relationship. Jonathan, once strong and decisive, found himself doubting even the simplest acts. A kind word from a neighbor sparked suspicion. A shadow falling across a room set his heart racing. He understood, in ways he could never fully articulate, how deeply Margaret had imprinted patterns of control into his mind. Trust had been weaponized, love had been perverted, and every instinct he had once relied upon was now suspect. Survivors were left with a lingering awareness that danger is often unseen, that perception itself can be manipulated, and that terror need not announce itself to be effective. Even the town itself bore psychological scars. Families who had once walked freely among neighbors now moved cautiously, their attention split between ordinary concerns and the unspoken possibility of manipulation. Stories passed quietly at dusk, warnings whispered to the next generation. Watch the hands that comfort you, listen to the words that lull you. Nothing is as simple as it seems. The collective consciousness had been altered. The Whitman house was gone, its secrets exposed, yet the lesson remained embedded in every interaction, every expectation, every subtle social calculation. And yet, the horror of Margaret's method transcended the local. Anyone who studied her patterns, her patience, her observation, her exploitation of human psychology, began to understand a terrifying universal truth. Power is most absolute when invisible. Influence exercised subtly over time with precision is far more dangerous than any violent outburst. The mind itself can be bound, reshaped and dominated without leaving a mark, and those who fail to recognize it are already complicit in their own subjugation. This is why her story endures, whispered not just as a cautionary tale, but as a roadmap. It teaches that vigilance must extend beyond fear of violence into fear of manipulation, that survival requires perception sharper than instinct, and that evil often arrives disguised as devotion. The Whitman household was only the beginning, an example of how easily control can infiltrate the ordinary, the loving, the trusted. Even after Margaret's crimes were exposed, the machinery of society moved to bury the truth. Reports were indicted, testimonies altered, and records lost or destroyed. The official narrative painted her as a disturbed individual, an anomaly, a cautionary tale limited to a single household. Few dared to ask deeper questions. Why had the disappearances gone unnoticed for years? Why had neighbors, authorities, and clergy ignored the subtle signs? The system itself seemed invested in maintaining the illusion of normalcy, ensuring that fear remained localized and comprehensible. This denial was not accidental. Those in power understood that knowledge of manipulation, if widespread, threatened the foundation of control itself. Margaret's methods, her patience, her observation, her ability to invisibly bend behavior, could be applied anywhere. Institutions, whether town councils, religious authorities, or judicial systems, depended on obedience, trust, and the suppression of inconvenient truths. To reveal the full extent of her strategies would be to reveal vulnerabilities in every structure of authority, every community, every family. Historians who later pieced together fragments of the Whitman case were faced with a disturbing realization. Margaret's system was a blueprint. Her control over perception, her subtle conditioning of thought, and her orchestration of fear revealed principles that transcended her household. One could trace the same patterns in the suppression of inconvenient knowledge, in bureaucratic inertia, and in the quiet enforcement of social compliance. The lesson was stark. Systems of power are sustained not just through law, but through the invisible shaping of perception, the quiet reinforcement of obedience, and the normalization of denial. Even ordinary townspeople participated, often unknowingly. When they ignored anomalies, dismissed their intuition, or rationalized disturbing events, they were reinforcing the invisible architecture of control Margaret had exemplified. This was the real horror of her influence. It did not require violence to endure. It thrived on silence, complicity, and the subtle recalibration of expectation. Fear became internalized, instinct became unreliable, and truth became a puzzle only a few could perceive. For those willing to look beyond comfort and certainty, Margaret's story is not merely historical. It is a revelation of the invisible systems governing thought and behavior, a lesson in how control can infiltrate ordinary life, and a warning that what appears as safety may, in fact, be the architecture of domination itself. Decades passed, yet the Whitman legacy lingered, not in monuments or memorials, but in the quiet shaping of minds. Children who grew up hearing whispers about Margaret's deeds internalized fear and vigilance as natural states of being. Patterns of suspicion, caution, and obedience wove themselves into the very fabric of the town's culture. Unnoticed yet unyielding, every smile was measured, every gesture examined, and every story questioned. Even ordinary life carried the residue of her manipulations, the invisible framework of control that she had perfected in her own home. Those who studied the town later noted an unsettling pattern. Families that had lived through the events passed on behaviors unconsciously, the habit of over-observation, the instinct to defer to authority, the subtle distrust of strangers, and the learned skill of maintaining composure while masking fear. Margaret's teachings, embedded in action rather than words, had become a generational blueprint. She had demonstrated in living practice how influence could be embedded in ordinary interactions, and how the seeds of obedience and compliance could grow quietly in fertile soil. Even the laws, the institutions, the community councils had been subtly shaped. Reports of irregularities were filed and forgotten, complaints whispered and dismissed, and anomalies rationalized. In retrospect, it became clear that her methods were not limited to the household alone. They reflected principles mirrored in social structures, governance, and the psychology of obedience itself. Margaret had exposed a system that thrived not on overt oppression, but on subtle recalibration of perception, leveraging trust and fear in tandem to shape behavior. The survivors, now adults, found themselves perpetuating these behaviors, unknowingly teaching vigilance, obedience, and silent fear to the next generation. The town had internalized the lesson that power is not always visible, that control is most enduring when concealed, and that those who can manipulate perception hold dominion over minds without lifting a hand. Margaret's influence had become a living, breathing part of the community, an unspoken rule of conduct, and a shadow over ordinary life. Her story, therefore, is more than horror. It is a warning. The mechanisms of subtle control, once understood, reveal that nothing is as secure as it seems, that even love and loyalty can be manipulated, and that awareness is both the shield and the weapon. Those who see clearly are forever changed, attuned to shadows and subtleties others cannot perceive. Margaret's control extended beyond observation and subtle gestures. She embedded her influence in rituals, routines, and coded communication, practices invisible to the untrained eye. The folding of linens, the precise arrangement of objects, even the sequence in which she greeted guests, all carried meaning. Each act was a signal, a test, a calibration of trust and obedience. The uninitiated dismissed these as quirks, signs of meticulous housekeeping or eccentricity, but in reality, each motion, each pattern reinforced her invisible dominion over perception and behavior. Her correspondence offers further insight. Letters to friends and distant relatives were layered with double meanings, instructive metaphors, and psychological cues. A single word, capitalized or underlined, could prompt fear, obedience, or reflection in the recipient. What appeared as gentle advice or familial counsel was, in truth, a methodical shaping of minds across miles. Even those unaware of the context found themselves acting according to her design, demonstrating the reach of her understanding and the subtlety of her control. Within the household, Margaret conducted rituals that reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and fear without ever raising her voice. Simple tasks, cleaning, cooking, even tending the garden, were executed according to invisible rules she alone understood. Children, servants, and Jonathan himself were guided by silent signals, conditioned to react in ways that maintained the structure she imposed. Through repetition, observation, and correction, she had built a system that required no physical coercion. The mind itself became a tool under her influence, internalizing the patterns she desired. These methods reveal a terrifying truth. Mastery of perception and subtle manipulation can surpass brute force in potency. Margaret's genius lay in her ability to render control nearly invisible, to integrate it seamlessly into ordinary routines, and to ensure that obedience and fear were maintained by the subject's own mind. The horror is that once embedded, these patterns are difficult to eradicate. Awareness alone is insufficient. The lessons have been internalized, encoded into habit, instinct, and reaction. By studying her techniques, we glimpse a forbidden domain, the psychology of invisible control, the architecture of obedience, and the terrifying efficiency of a mind that understands human behavior to its core. Margaret Whitman was not just a murderer. She was a scholar of domination, a strategist of the unseen, and a master of the systems that govern perception and loyalty. What Margaret perfected in her home was not confined to domestic life. It reflected universal principles of influence that could shape entire communities, organizations, even governments. Her understanding of human behavior, of obedience and perception revealed a terrifying blueprint. Power can be exercised quietly, invisibly, and with devastating efficiency. The same patterns she used to control Jonathan, servants, and neighbors could be applied to institutions, political systems, and societal hierarchies. Subtle manipulation becomes systemic when repeated, codified, and reinforced. Consider the institutions surrounding her town. Officials, clergy, and community leaders all unknowingly participated in her web. Letters ignored, complaints dismissed, reports lost. These were not acts of negligence alone, but the natural result of her methods applied on a broader scale. People trusted appearances, deferred to authority, and rationalized anomalies. Margaret understood that true power lies not in overt domination, but in shaping the perception of what is normal, acceptable, or inevitable. Through small, deliberate interventions, she created compliance before anyone even realized it was happening. Even the town's social dynamics reflected her influence. Families learned to monitor one another, neighbors acted cautiously, and children were taught to obey without question. What appeared as moral instruction or social etiquette was, in fact, a continuation of Margaret's system. conditioning behavior to maintain order, reduce resistance, and ensure that no one questioned authority too closely. The invisible chains she had forged within her household became mirrored patterns throughout the community, amplified by culture, fear, and habit. Her methods illuminate a chilling reality. Society itself is vulnerable to the same techniques she used. Systems of power, political, religious, corporate, depend on control of perception. When obedience is internalized, when fear and trust are balanced in precise measure, the mechanisms of authority become nearly invisible. Margaret's household was a microcosm, a laboratory demonstrating principles that, if understood and applied, could manipulate entire populations without overt force. This is why her story resonates far beyond the 19th century. To recognize her methods is to glimpse the architecture of influence itself, the hidden levers that govern behavior and thought. And once seen, there is no turning back. You cannot unsee how obedience, fear, and trust can be calibrated, exploited, and weaponized. The town itself became a living testament to Margaret's methods. Decades after her arrest, parents spoke in hushed tones, warning children about unseen dangers, teaching them to obey, to question carefully, to measure every glance and word. The lessons were unspoken, yet profound. Fear and trust could be weaponized, loyalty could conceal peril, and ordinary life was never as safe as it appeared. Margaret's influence had seeped into the collective consciousness, shaping behavior with an invisible hand. Survivors of the Whitman household carried the imprint of her control into their own families. Children who had endured subtle manipulations, cryptic warnings, and calculated terror internalized vigilance as instinct. They grew hyper-aware, reading intentions in the subtlest gestures, questioning the motives behind every smile, every act of kindness. Margaret had not only influenced them directly, she had trained them to propagate her lessons, creating generations attuned to subtle power dynamics, conditioned to respond to manipulation before recognizing it. Even those who had no direct contact with her learned the patterns unconsciously. Disappearances, minor tragedies, and unexplained events were rationalized and normalized, reinforcing obedience and compliance. The town's culture shifted imperceptibly. Silence became a tool, observation became a skill, and suspicion was embedded as a protective measure. Each household mirrored the subtle manipulations that Margaret had demonstrated so effectively, even in her absence. What is perhaps most terrifying is how quickly these patterns spread and endured. Institutions, families, social hierarchies, they all became extensions of the invisible architecture she had demonstrated. Fear and trust became currencies. Perception became the battlefield. Margaret's genius was not merely in her cruelty, but in her demonstration of how invisible influence could outlast the individual, shaping entire communities, conditioning generations, and creating systems of obedience that no law could fully contain. This is the lesson that endures. Those who understand subtle influence recognize that power is rarely enforced through force alone. True mastery lies in invisibility, in conditioning perception, in shaping behavior before the target even realizes they are being guided. And now, for those who have followed this far, the question is not simply whether you can see the shadow of control, but whether you are willing to acknowledge it within yourself and the world around you. Margaret's household, terrifying as it was, serves as a microcosm for forces far greater than any single town. Her mastery of invisible influence mirrors the ways power operates in every society, subtly, systematically, and often without public acknowledgement. Those who govern, whether in politics, corporations, or institutions, rely on the same principles: manipulation of perception, control of trust, and conditioning of behavior. The Whitman case reveals the underlying architecture of authority, the mechanisms by which obedience is maintained long before coercion becomes necessary. Consider how patterns she used: small acts of reassurance, calibrated fear, selective concealment of information, translate into governance. Policies are framed to shape belief, laws enforced to produce compliance, and institutions designed to reward obedience while silencing skepticism. Fear is never overt. It is embedded into ritual, hierarchy, and social expectation. Margaret's methods illustrate, in miniature, the invisible levers of power that operate in every layer of society. Understanding her is to glimpse the machinery of influence itself. The town, conditioned by her presence, became a laboratory of behavioral adaptation. Ordinary citizens internalized rules of caution, suspicion, and careful observation, replicating the mechanisms she had mastered. Neighbors monitored one another unconsciously. Authorities reinforced the invisible system of control by ignoring anomalies, and even the most well-intentioned individuals were guided by patterns they did not consciously recognize. This is the frightening truth. Control does not require tyrants. It requires subtle orchestration and the willing participation of those who believe themselves free. Historians later noted anomalies in the Whitman case, missing records, contradictory testimonies, and social behaviors that could not be fully explained by circumstance alone. These were not accidents. They were echoes of a system designed to obscure, to normalize, and to perpetuate control through perception rather than force. Margaret had not merely acted alone, she had illuminated principles that could be applied anywhere by anyone who understood the psychology of subtle dominance. The lesson is unavoidable. Wherever trust is assumed, obedience is expected, and perception is shaped, there lies the potential for silent mastery. Recognizing this is the first step toward seeing hidden structures, understanding influence, and refusing the invisible chains that bind so many. Those who comprehend it are forever changed, aware of the hidden levers that govern human behavior, and of the dangers of remaining blind to them. To grasp the full scope of Margaret's mastery is to confront a profound, disorienting truth. Knowledge itself can be both a weapon and a curse. Those who study her methods, her subtle manipulations, her orchestration of trust and fear, her calibration of human perception, cannot unsee what she revealed. The mind, once illuminated to these hidden structures, is forever changed. Simple interactions become riddled with suspicion. Ordinary gestures are analyzed for intent, and the boundary between love, obedience, and manipulation is no longer obvious. Ethically, this knowledge is dangerous. Understanding the mechanics of control does not absolve one from moral responsibility, it amplifies it. With insight comes the capacity to influence, to guide, to dominate without force. One can cultivate loyalty, suppress dissent, and bend perception as Margaret did, quietly and invisibly. The same skills that allow recognition of manipulation also empower the practitioner to enact it. Awareness is a double-edged sword. It protects, yet it tempts. Psychologically, the impact is profound. Survivors of Margaret's household, and anyone who follows her methods in study, experience a shift in cognition. Patterns emerge where none existed before. Trust is measured, gestures interpreted, intentions probed. Everyday life becomes a game of perception and inference, where misjudgment carries consequences not merely social, but existential. Fear becomes anticipatory, intuition sharpened into a weapon, and the ordinary fabric of reality gains a hidden, almost menacing depth. This is why Margaret's story is not merely historical, it is transformational. It forces a confrontation with invisible systems of control and the ease with which perception can be manipulated. To ignore these lessons is to remain blind. To acknowledge them is to enter a new domain of understanding, one where power is recognized in its quietest forms, and danger lies not in what is seen, but in what is assumed. For those listening closely, this is the point of no return. Awareness has consequences. Once you perceive the subtle chains of influence, you cannot unsee them. Ordinary life becomes a map of hidden levers, and your role within the system, whether as observer, participant, or manipulator, is suddenly clearer. Margaret's brilliance lay in her ability to convert fear and trust into instruments of control. She understood that obedience is rarely enforced by threats alone. It is cultivated, nurtured, and internalized. By alternating reassurance with subtle intimidation, She trained her household to respond automatically to cues they scarcely recognized. The mind, when conditioned in this way, becomes a willing participant in its own submission, anticipating rules, obeying before command, fearing consequences that may never materialize. The psychology of fear is delicate yet absolute. Fear can immobilize, provoke compliance, and sharpen perception simultaneously. Margaret used it as both shield and sword, a whispered warning, a shadow in the hallway, a fleeting expression. Each became a calibrated stimulus. Responses were catalogued, weaknesses identified, and corrections applied with surgical precision. The result was a system where behavior was predictable, yet the individuals believed themselves free, acting voluntarily within invisible boundaries. Obedience, once learned, is self-perpetuating. A single act of submission reinforces the next, until the mind internalizes the rules of its own restriction. Margaret's household was a laboratory demonstrating this principle in its purest form. Authority need not announce itself. Control is more efficient when invisible, when compliance arises without overt coercion, and when fear is internalized rather than externally applied. This is a truth that resonates far beyond one household. It is a universal pattern in human behavior. She exploited human tendencies expertly. The desire for acceptance, the need to avoid conflict, the instinct to trust authority figures, and the natural drive to maintain social cohesion. By orchestrating these impulses, she created a self-sustaining system of dominance. Observers, even well-intentioned, were drawn into the framework, perpetuating it unconsciously. This is why her story is not merely about horror, it is a blueprint for understanding how influence operates on every scale, from homes to societies, from families to institutions. Now, recognize this. Obedience is not simply compliance. It is the subtle surrender of perception, the voluntary adoption of constraints, and the internalization of control. Margaret's methods reveal how easily the human mind can be guided, how invisible levers shape behavior, and how those who understand these levers can wield power far greater than brute force ever allows. Margaret's control relied on a delicate balance between trust and deception, reinforced by anticipation. She knew that fear alone is fleeting, and authority alone is limited. The true power lies in shaping expectations, guiding perception, and exploiting the mind's natural tendency to predict outcomes. Every action she took was a signal, every word a subtle cue. Those around her did not realize they were participants in a system designed to preemptively shape their responses. Trust, in Margaret's design, was both weapon and shield. By appearing nurturing, attentive, and sincere, she lowered defenses, creating a psychological comfort zone in which obedience could flourish. This trust was carefully curated, built over weeks, months, years, until even instinctual suspicion was softened by the familiarity of her presence. Once it was established, she could manipulate behavior without confrontation. The mind that trusts becomes a willing instrument of its own control. Deception operated alongside trust, often invisible, almost imperceptible. Margaret concealed her intentions in routine, misdirection, and charm. A compliment here, a question there, an expression timed to perfection. All these acted as invisible levers, shaping thought and guiding behavior. The deception was never chaotic. It followed a pattern, predictable only to her. And because it was subtle, it could endure indefinitely, leaving observers unaware of the manipulation shaping their every action. Anticipation was the third pillar. Margaret could predict reactions before they occurred, calibrating her influence to maximize compliance while minimizing resistance. Every gesture, word, and signal was part of a feedback loop, continuously tested and refined. Her mastery of anticipation ensured that those under her sway acted as she intended, often believing they were making independent choices. Fear, trust, and expectation were intertwined into a system of invisible governance, each component reinforcing the others with terrifying precision. This is the ultimate lesson. Power is not only about domination, It is about the subtle orchestration of perception. When trust is calibrated, deception is invisible, and anticipation is exploited, behavior becomes predictable, and obedience self-perpetuating. Margaret's genius lay not in violence, but in this psychological triangle. Those who comprehend it recognize the hidden architecture of influence, and once understood, the mind cannot return to innocence. The Whitman household was only the surface of a deeper truth. The principles Margaret applied in private mirror the mechanisms by which institutions maintain control. Governments, religious hierarchies, and corporate systems rely on the same subtle levers she wielded with terrifying precision. Obedience is cultivated, dissent minimized, and perception manipulated, not through violence, but through normalization, expectation, and invisible cues. Those who look carefully can trace patterns that span families, communities, and entire societies. Societal complicity amplifies these systems. Individuals conditioned to trust authority, defer to hierarchy, and rationalize anomalies, unwittingly perpetuate control. When records are lost, complaints dismissed, or events ignored, the system continues seamlessly, reinforcing obedience without overt enforcement. Margaret's methods demonstrated this on a microcosmic level. Her household, like society itself, functioned because people participated, often unknowingly, in the very system that constrained them. Even subtle acts of denial and rationalization serve as tools of control. Witnesses who hesitated, neighbors who doubted their own perception, and officials who accepted convenient explanations all reinforced the framework she had created. Her genius lay in demonstrating that power does not require coercion to endure. Compliance can be engineered, fear internalized, and obedience made self-sustaining. Institutions operate in exactly the same way, embedding invisible hierarchies and conditioning behavior across generations. History, sanitized for public consumption, often obscures these mechanisms. Records are selective, narratives curated, and inconvenient truths hidden. Yet beneath the surface, the same psychological architecture persists: trust manipulated, fear calibrated, and perception guided. Margaret's case is terrifying precisely because it illuminates a universal reality. The mind itself can be controlled, subtly, invisibly, and permanently, and society, through participation and denial, becomes the instrument of that control. For those willing to confront it, this knowledge changes perception. Ordinary interactions are never simple. Authority, affection, and obedience are all potential tools, and understanding the architecture behind them is both liberating and disquieting. Margaret Whitman revealed this truth with precision, leaving a map for those perceptive enough to see, and a warning for all who remain blind. The psychological imprint Margaret left on her household and town extended far beyond her lifetime. Survivors carried invisible scars, patterns of vigilance and obedience that became second nature. Children learned to read expressions with precision, to anticipate consequences before they arrived, and to trust appearances only cautiously. These lessons, absorbed through fear and subtle guidance, became encoded into habit, shaping their decisions, their relationships, and eventually, the upbringing of their own children. The ripple effect was subtle, but relentless. Generations born after Margaret's arrest absorbed her lessons without knowing it, inheriting behaviors cultivated under her influence. A whispered warning here, a precaution there, even the rhythm of conversation in the town bore traces of her methodology. Families internalized vigilance, neighbors monitored one another unconsciously, and compliance became normalized. Fear, once external, had been internalized. Trust, once freely given, had to be earned and tested. Margaret's mastery of psychological conditioning had become a template for life itself. Even strangers passing through the town reported an odd sensation, an invisible weight in the air, as if behavior and thought were subtly constrained. Social interactions were governed by unspoken rules, patterns of observation, inference, and compliance that ensured order, yet maintained a quiet tension beneath the surface. Those who had not experienced Margaret directly were nonetheless guided by her legacy, demonstrating how deeply invisible influence can penetrate communal consciousness. Her story also reveals a broader truth about human behavior. Subtle conditioning is often more durable than overt coercion. Obedience learned through fear, trust, and anticipation persists, replicating itself through generations. Ordinary life becomes a network of invisible levers, shaping perception, behavior, and thought, without anyone fully understanding the source. Margaret's genius was not in what she destroyed, but in what she built. A system of influence so quiet, so precise, that it outlasted her physical presence. And now, take a moment to reflect. The patterns she created exist not only in history, but in every system of power you encounter today. Recognizing them is a transformation. To see the invisible chains is to be changed forever, attuned to the hidden mechanisms that guide obedience, perception, and trust. Once this knowledge enters the mind, it cannot be removed. Margaret's mastery of influence was mirrored, on a grander scale, in the mechanisms of institutional power. Governments, corporations, religious hierarchies, all rely on invisible levers, calibrated manipulation, and the shaping of perception to maintain compliance. Her household was a laboratory, a microcosm of the same psychological architecture that allows societies to function while keeping control largely hidden. The patterns she demonstrated, trust cultivated, fear subtle yet constant, obedience internalized, are universal principles of domination. Institutions thrive on the same dynamics she perfected. Policies are framed not just to enforce rules, but to shape expectations and guide behavior. Laws, regulations, and social norms create boundaries that appear voluntary, yet subtly constrain choices. Fear, trust, and anticipation, Margaret's invisible triangle of control, operate in parallel within hierarchies, ensuring that compliance is achieved quietly, without overt coercion. Her genius lies in demonstrating that authority is most potent when unseen, when obedience is internalized, and when perception is carefully guided. Societal complicity reinforces the system. Ordinary citizens participate unwittingly, rationalizing decisions, deferring to authority, and ignoring anomalies. Like the neighbors who failed to question Margaret's actions, society becomes both the tool and the target of its own conditioning. The mechanisms she employed reveal how behavior, belief, and loyalty can be orchestrated systematically, creating a cycle of silent dominance that extends far beyond one household. Even the most perceptive observers struggle to comprehend the full extent of influence when it operates invisibly. Margaret's methods illuminate the principle: control is most effective when it is unseen, subtle, and self-perpetuating. Systems built on these principles endure because participants are guided into compliance by their own minds, interpreting guidance as choice and regulation as natural order. It is a terrifyingly efficient model of power, one that explains how societies can maintain cohesion, yet simultaneously manipulate perception and behavior without force. For those willing to confront it, the Whitman case is a revelation. The principles Margaret mastered in a single home are not isolated curiosities. They are blueprints for understanding human systems, the psychology of obedience, and the invisible mechanisms that allow influence to persist across generations and institutions. Knowledge of this transforms perception, revealing hidden structures in places once considered ordinary, and in doing so, changes the observer forever. To truly understand Margaret's mastery is to awaken to a new reality. Awareness of her methods is not abstract, it reshapes perception, revealing the invisible architecture of control in every interaction, every institution, every relationship. Ordinary gestures, casual words, and routine patterns suddenly appear loaded with potential influence. Those who see cannot unsee. They are changed forever, attuned to the subtle levers that guide thought and behavior, and aware of the silent currents of power flowing beneath everyday life. This awakening is not comfortable. Knowledge of hidden manipulation brings unease, suspicion, and a heightened sense of vigilance. Everyday interactions become puzzles to decode, social cues become signals to analyze, and trust becomes conditional, measured, and often delayed. The mind, once naive, now perceives layers of intent, anticipating consequences before they manifest. What some might call paranoia is, in this context, clarity. The cost of insight is the loss of innocence, yet there is also empowerment. Awareness of the mechanisms of influence provides tools for self-mastery. Recognizing patterns allows one to anticipate manipulation, resist coercion, and assert autonomy where others unconsciously comply. Margaret's methods, though terrifying in their intent, offer a roadmap for understanding how power operates and how it can be countered. To see the architecture of obedience is to gain the keys to your own agency, but the transformation comes with responsibility. Insight alone is not enough. The observer must decide how to act. Will they use this knowledge for protection, for liberation, or for domination? Margaret demonstrated the consequences of unbridled application, but the lesson is universal. Understanding hidden influence changes not only perception, but moral responsibility. To see is to bear the weight of choice, to confront the consequences of knowledge that can shape minds, manipulate behavior, and bend reality in subtle but absolute ways. And now, for those listening, this is your turning point. To understand Margaret Whitman is to enter a domain where perception, fear, trust, and obedience are tools, and where knowledge itself is transformative. You can never return to the world as it appeared before. You are now attuned to the hidden structures guiding every interaction. Understanding Margaret Whitman comes with a perilous clarity. The knowledge of control is inherently seductive. Once the mechanisms of influence, obedience, and fear are revealed, they tempt the mind. The ability to anticipate reactions, to guide perception, to orchestrate behavior. These are not just observations, they are tools. And the human mind, drawn to power, is often unable to resist experimenting with them. The danger is that insight can easily slip into application, curiosity into manipulation. Ethically, this is a paradox. Knowledge grants liberation, the capacity to see hidden levers and defend oneself, but it also grants temptation, the capacity to dominate. Every observer must confront the moral implications of awareness. Will this knowledge be wielded responsibly or exploited? Margaret herself demonstrated the consequences of misuse, but the lesson applies universally. The observer, now awakened, carries both power and burden. To ignore the ethical dimension is to court corruption. The irreversible nature of this insight cannot be overstated. Once the mind recognizes how subtly behavior can be shaped, it can never return to ignorance. Ordinary life is forever reframed. Gestures, words, rules, and rituals are interpreted as signals. Intentions are questioned, and trust is measured with scrutiny. Comfort is replaced with perception, innocence with vigilance. Those who understand cannot unsee the hidden systems in which they live and move. This is the cost of forbidden knowledge. Awareness liberates, but it isolates. Understanding provides power, but it exposes one to moral peril. To see the invisible architecture of influence is to inherit both responsibility and temptation, and the mind cannot forget what it now knows. Margaret's story is not just horror. It is a mirror, reflecting the potential for dominance inherent in human systems and the ethical crossroads faced by every observer. And now consider this: the knowledge she left is alive, echoing in patterns, structures, and behaviors across time. Once perceived, these patterns demand acknowledgement. To recognize them is to transform perception permanently, to enter a domain where insight is inseparable from responsibility, and to confront the seductive danger of unseen power. Margaret's influence did not end with her household or her immediate circle. It radiated outward like a subtle contagion, infecting the minds and behaviors of those who came into contact with the patterns she perfected. Observation, expectation, and subtle Coercion propagated quietly, unnoticed, until entire communities unconsciously adopted her system. Fear, trust, and obedience became internalized mechanisms not enforced by law or violence, but by the invisible architecture she had revealed. Even generations later, the echoes of her methods were evident. Families who never met her still exhibited hypervigilance, careful monitoring of behavior, and ingrained deference to authority. Neighborhoods, towns, and social networks mirrored the patterns of subtle manipulation she had demonstrated. Compliance achieved without confrontation, fear internalized, and trust cautiously granted. Margaret's genius was in teaching the principle that influence does not require physical control. It spreads like a virus through perception, thought, and expectation. The mechanisms were frighteningly simple in theory, yet devastating in effect. Anticipate behavior, calibrate responses, subtly guide perception, and allow obedience to arise voluntarily. When practiced over time, this system reproduces itself, generations teaching the next without conscious instruction. The town became a laboratory of invisible influence, a living example of how control can perpetuate indefinitely, surviving beyond the originator and adapting to new contexts. Even those who believed themselves immune were affected. Outsiders, officials, and new families absorbed the patterns unconsciously. They acted according to expectations set long before they arrived, demonstrating the terrifying reach of systemic psychological influence. Margaret's methods proved that the mind is fertile ground for domination when perception is manipulated subtly, continuously, and invisibly. Now, realize the gravity of this truth. Patterns of control are not confined to history. They exist in every system you encounter, social, institutional, political, and they operate largely unseen. Margaret Whitman's household was a microcosm, a laboratory revealing principles that, once understood, allow perception to be decoded, obedience to be anticipated, and influence to be recognized in its most efficient, invisible form. Those who perceive it are forever changed, attuned to currents of power that most never even notice. All of Margaret's mastery, her subtle manipulations, her orchestration of trust and fear, her calibration of perception, converges into a single, undeniable lesson. Power is invisible, patient, and absolute when it is internalized. Those who understand this see the world differently. Ordinary life becomes a map of influence, obedience, and hidden levers. Every interaction, every gesture, every word carries potential meaning, and the mind, once awakened, can never ignore these patterns again. The Whitman case demonstrates the terrifying efficiency of subtle control. Violence is unnecessary when perception is shaped, fear is calibrated, and obedience arises voluntarily. Her household, her town, and the ripple effects across generations illustrate that domination can be perfected in silence, invisibly woven into the fabric of life. Institutions, families, and social networks all operate under the same psychological principles, and those who fail to recognize them remain unwitting participants. For the observer, the transformation is profound. Awareness brings clarity, insight, and the power to anticipate influence, but also burden and responsibility. The mind can no longer accept appearances at face value. Trust is measured, actions are interpreted, and the invisible currents of control are always present. Once perceived, these structures cannot be unseen. They demand recognition, understanding, and vigilance. Yet there is a paradoxical gift. Insight allows self-mastery. Recognizing the mechanics of obedience, fear, and trust grants the ability to rule, resist manipulation, to navigate influence, and even to shape perception ethically. Margaret's methods, while terrifying in their application, offer a blueprint for understanding human behavior at its most fundamental level. The lesson is clear. Knowledge transforms perception, and perception shapes destiny. Now, for those who have followed this journey to its depths, it is time to engage fully. Write a symbolic phrase twice in the comments to lock your identity transformation and align yourself with the awareness you have gained. This is not merely interaction, it is a ritual of recognition, a step toward mastery of your own perception, and a commitment to seeing the world as it truly is. Once done, you can never return to the comfortable illusions of ignorance. The Whitman house no longer stands, yet its presence endures in ways the eye cannot see. The lessons Margaret left behind persist in the architecture of perception, the subtle calibrations of trust and fear, and the invisible currents of influence that shape behavior across generations. Those who lived through her household carried echoes of control, and those who study her methods today inherit knowledge that cannot be unlearned. Consider this: the world around you is a reflection of the same principles. Institutions, relationships, and society itself operate under invisible levers: expectations, fear, trust, and anticipation guiding decisions before consciousness even registers them. Margaret's genius was in demonstrating how ordinary life can be structured to ensure obedience, how perception itself can be the battlefield, and how subtle influence is more enduring than brute force. The mind, once attuned, cannot unsee the architecture of control, nor can it ignore the responsibility that comes with insight. Her story is both a warning and a revelation. Those who encounter her methods must choose. Will they use this knowledge for awareness and liberation, or will they succumb to the seductive power of unseen influence? Understanding the mechanics of control forever changes perception. Every gesture, every word, every interaction is now a test, a signal, a subtle calibration. Once this world is seen, the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and nothing appears as simple as it once did. The darkness she left behind is not merely history, it is a lens through which reality is forever transformed. Awareness is a double-edged sword. It shields the mind, yet exposes it. It grants clarity, yet isolates. It illuminates, yet reveals danger in every shadow. To know Margaret Whitman is to understand that fear and obedience are tools, that perception can be manipulated, and that the mind itself can be both prisoner and master. And now, as you sit in the quiet of your room, consider this. The lessons are alive. They flow through communities, through families, through every social structure you encounter. You have glimpsed forbidden knowledge, and the world can never appear the same. Listen closely to the invisible, observe the unseen, and remember, the shadows are where control resides, and only the aware can navigate them without falling prey.